and shop for shit. I think there's nothing about us at all that's like anyone else in LA.
Yeah, I know. And I work for the computer industry, and this guy's a management consultant
Who works mostly for the computer industry. So we're basically a couple of old tech guys.
who couldn't afford to work for NASA.
Or SpaceX.
We didn't get into Caltech, and thank God we didn't have to stick with TRW or something like that. Jeez.
Yeah, but those guys got to put shit on the moon. That would have been pretty cool.
Yeah, but not in my generation.
No, we would have been working on the space shuttle, which would have sucked.
In my generation, people don't even know what TRW stands for.
Yeah. Amazing.
But there was still Fluke. There was still Bunker Ramo. There was still Rocketdyne.
There's a whole defense industry out there. We could be building secret weapons to kill more and more people. I mean, there's upside in that.
There's work.
It's work if you can get it.
Really?
So today sort of has been fun. I have been on Facebook a bunch this week because I've been working on a couple of big documents and on giant conference calls about those documents. And if you watch my activity on Facebook, you'll see these bursts of activity which coincide very typically with conference calls. So if you work with me and wonder what I'm doing when you're talking to me about something. But in seriousness, one of the things I've done is with a liberal commentator who I don't know, who's another tech guy who lives in Arizona, named Eric Critchlow. We've been having a series of conversations back and forth. And we came up with a list of topics because the question is, am I really a Democrat? Or what do I think the Democrats ought to do?
Okay. That's the origin.
And one of the things we talked about today was the question of affirmative action. And I did a short post in which I basically said, I'm for it, but I think we're doing it wrong, in that I argued for class-based rather than race-based affirmative action. I basically said that I thought it was unfair that the kids of a middle-class tech guy, like the one I'm looking at across the table, got a break in going to college as compared to the kids of, say, a poor white farm worker from Iowa who, has no educational access in the community they live in, who has no educational history in their family, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that basically, if we were to shift it to being by class, the black, brown, and yellow people who'd been left behind by the emergence of the person of color middle class would lose their breaks, but the people who had been left behind in the cities and the people who had been left behind in the countryside would still get breaks, and as a result, we'd still be leveling the playing field. The question is just how. So
I don't think we do class very well, and the only place that we start to do class at a decent level is when somebody starts talking about gentrification. Other than that, I haven't necessarily broken it out by left or right or liberal or conservative, but I look at the kind of people that we put on the evening news, and David Brinkley was ugly, weird looking dude, and he had a little strange voice, and so did McNeil and Lair, but they're the exception, and the people we put on news now all look like yuppies. And so I don't think we actually even know how to talk about class, because those people with the power who are in charge of talking to everybody tries to make everybody talk the same way.
Well, I also think we don't talk about class, and this is an interesting wrinkle. I think that we do have a multi-ethnic ruling class today. I think that Charles Murray wrote about kind of a great sort in which all the smart people moved to a couple of cities.
Yeah.
And all those cities voted for Hillary Clinton. And everyone else kind of got left behind. And all the smart people weren't white.
Yeah.
And so what we have is a series of communities where there's people like you and people like me and people like the browner version of me and people like the more Asian version of me. And we all kind of do the same stuff. I'm laughing because today Michael and I are literally wearing the same clothes, which was very depressing. It's very depressing to be typecast that hard when you think about it. But what happens is it's easy for me to justify my existence in this narrowing class of people who have power and culture if I can talk about my own kind of race-based or other-based oppression. And what I get to do is I can defend the moat, right, which keeps me in my relatively privileged position while at the same time sort of maintaining my status as somebody, you know, who is deserving. And that's a little harsh, but it's something that's, I think, part of the mechanism.
Well, the part of that is also, I mean, you're just a mark, and I don't mean by your name, but you make yourself a mark by walking into that kind of Bullworth, I'm guilty, some of these days somebody like Tupac is going to hit me upside the head, and don't I deserve that for
Right.
what I've been getting away with all these years?
Well, but you know, interestingly, and you just made the exact counter argument to what Eric made on Facebook. And I wanted to talk about Eric's argument because I think it's really important and powerful, and I think it's at the center of a lot of issues in our world today. And what he basically said was, yeah, Mark, great idea to do class-based affirmative action, and practically it's really good and it probably have good outcomes, but it doesn't deal with an important truth. And the important truth is that middle-class black people are angry, and they feel the wound of the treatment of black people in America for much of American history. And that you don't get to just sort of go ollie ollie oxen free and let my kids go to college and declare that it's over. Now, I'm not sure I agree with him. I get where that emotion comes from, and it's funny because the place I've heard exactly that claim before was in talking about the Middle East. And there was this great interview in like 2007 or 2008 with the head of Al Jazeera. And they were talking about like, why is the Arab world so effed up? And the basic comment was that you have to understand the psychic injury that was done to us by Israel's victory in '67. And that the existence of Israel and that the fact that they can continually beat us are this issue which we will never recover from until we can even the tables.
Yes, but if you ask the average black American how many people have been lynched in America, they'll say 500,000, where the number is closer to 4,000. And when you talk about that, I mean, over a period of 100 years, what the Urban League was founded to raise awareness about lynching in the North, where people were not being lynched, and they hung a banner outside their headquarters window, say, today a black man was lynched. And we kind of, there's a politics of difference, a politics of opposition, a politics of afflicting the comfortable that is very popular with the black middle class, until it comes to, do you want Tupac and Biggie living on your block selling rocks? And then you will hear where the quote-unquote single black community, that monolith, breaks up. And it breaks up hard.
And I have kind of divided in the past, and I want to bookmark this because I want to do a big circle and come back. You know, I work with and I train with and know a lot of police officers, and one of the issues that we talk about a lot is not only police violence, but the kind of overt disrespect that black people get from cops on a relatively frequent basis. Good friend of ours is an assistant district attorney here in LA, a powerful woman in the city. She's black. She was training to run the LA Marathon and was driving from her house in Ladera Heights to the marina to be part of whatever running club these idiots who run marathons are part of. And didn't bring her wallet, didn't bring ID, just brought her keys and her phone. Gets lit up by the sheriffs for whatever reason, didn't signal, whatever. She's a black woman driving a Lexus, you know, doesn't look made up and nice. Cop pulls her out, you know, curbs her. She's sitting on the curb, and she's smart enough to know how to deal with the cop.
Right.
She's telling the cop, call so-and-so who's your watch commander and who runs the precinct that you work out of.
Right.
And the cop is like, doesn't know what to do because her license plate comes back blocked. And there was a fair amount of consternation that got resolved when she handed the guy her cell phone and let him call the home phone number of somebody relatively senior in the sheriff's department. And, you know, a lot of apologies ensued and,
Right.
you know, make good was done. But the fact remains that wouldn't have happened if she was white.
Yeah, but that is a story with legs all the time.
But let me tell you why it happens from the cop's point of view. From the cop's point of view, there are two Michael Bowens, right? There's Michael Bowen, who lives in Redondo Beach and does very weird, serious tech work that nobody really understands and is sort of a expert in his domain. And there's Michael Bowen, who lives right across from Will Rogers Park, you know, in the back bedroom of a house that he rents a room in, and who makes a living doing whatever he can every day to just get by and pay rent.
And what you never hear is the story how one Michael Bowen is terrorized by the other Michael Bowen.
That's
the story that doesn't have legs.
No, that's a story, but let me finish my cop story, which is the problem that cops have, and I've seen it in them as they interact with black people, is they're not sure which Michael Bowen they're dealing with until they figure it out.
They never do.
And there's oh my God, which Michael Bowen is this? Now, I'm not saying there's not a healthy dose of racism that comes from dealing with the other Michael Bowen every day and assuming that everybody's like him, or that there's not a lot of cultural racism embedded in the PD. But I am saying that individual cops who are relatively well-intentioned have a difficult discrimination to make.
That's true, and I don't deny it. But here's the thing. Now, one thing you have to understand about me is when I was born, there were no black people in America. There were Negroes. And at some point, some of those Negroes said, we are tired of being Negroes. And we're not shuffling, and we're not begging, and we are going to use our power to get away with what we can get away with because we deserve it. And one of those such men was Thurgood Marshall. And the more you find out about what an ass kicker this guy was, you just kind of have to shake your head and say, I had no idea. And so if you grow up like this Michael Bowen, with some access to some strong families and some strong individuals who changed everybody from being Negroes to being black, then you recognize that there are some people who live without fear. There are some people who, as misguided as they were, like Stokely Carmichael, it was, I'm not taking shit from any cop or from anybody. And there's something about what happened to the Negro in America that made him big enough to be a man in the whole world. And the black middle class who took advantage of affirmative action were a league like that. And they made their marks. And on the same day that there are people today who say, well, another black man was shot, or what was it? I think it was the day that martial law was declared in Ferguson, because they made an announcement at night so they could say martial law is now, you know, and everybody was focused on that. That was the day that Lewis Hamilton won the Formula One championship. So the best race car driver in the world is black, and Michael Brown got murdered. And which black person do you want to pay attention to? This is kind of the same thing of, how come black people can say nigger and I can't say nigger? And I said, well, those niggas, between them niggas and their niggas, and of all the niggas, why do you want to be like those niggas? So it's like, you can focus on the underclass, the indigent, and the beat up black folks forever. And I think people get so used to doing that, and so used to telling that same story, that they forget that there is actual black strength that persists in strong families and people who don't back down. And ultimately, if that's what you want, that's what you want. You have to admit, I want black people who are not afraid of white people, who are not afraid of white cops, who have more power. And the more you keep talking about the black underclass, the less ability you have to even recognize which Michael Bowen you're talking to. And that's part of the problem.
Yeah, interesting.
You have to acknowledge that there are class distinctions within black America.
And there's no question to me that there are class distinctions not only in black America, in every part of America, and its class distinctions are fracturing us apart. But I think I want to loop back on this for a minute, because my initial reaction to what Eric said was negative, my pat reaction, right? And my pat reaction to people who talk about the debt that white America owes black people is, hey, big check was signed in 1865, right? Lots and lots of dead people. And it was at least a pretty substantial down payment. And secondly, which is a more effective way to lead your own life, to lead your life expecting reparations or to lead your life expecting to build? And then I thought about two things. I thought about the quote from the guy from Al Jazeera. And again, my reaction is, well, dude, your psychology is your problem. Why am I worried about this?
Right.
And I'm worried about this because I want there to be peace. I'm worried about this because as long as one side wants conflict, whether it's, the Arabs in the Middle East or black people in America who feel wronged and who build their lives around feeling wronged, we're going to have conflict, and we're going to have conflict that we don't need.
I agree. But again, you have to ask, how much conflict is conflict? I mean, how many people, how many Crips are taking their guns to Van Nuys instead of Compton?
Not that conflict doesn't. That conflict worries me for a different reason. I don't worry about insurrection, because what I worry about an insurrection is that you'd get killed. Some dipshit would kill you because there's an insurrection by black people and you're black, so therefore, well, bummer, you're on the wrong team.
Yeah.
What I worry about is that I have this theory about human capital, which is we need it. We need all of it we can have. And my issue with wasting human capital, my issue with not letting poor black kids get decent educations and not, letting them build and use their talents, is that we're pissing away a pool of human capital that we need and that we want. And that we can't afford as a society to do that. As a society, we need the talents of everybody in it. And it's worth something to get those talents to happen.
I agree. And that's a problem that we have with class. It's a problem that we have with class because everybody in America tends to look towards the upper middle class standard as what the good life means. I was watching a video from the guy who played Omar from The Wire. Really great video. You've probably seen it, where he says, "Am I being typecast?" And the guy to his right, with the do-rag on, says, "We're a particular type of people from a particular place, and we look a particular type. So what is that? We're a type." And that's true. But then the guy says, "Well, I'm not that type. Everybody who knows me knows I'm not that type." But he's not so sure. He acts a little bit of uncertainty in that as he sips his latte. And there is that uncertainty because we think perhaps at some point our class systems and our systems of respect are going to break. And they're going to break the old way.
Well, they are breaking, and the question is they're reforming. And they've reformed around kind of academic attainment more than anything else.
Yeah.
And and access to the media world. But I want to go back to this point, which is, if 5% of the people in America are walking around with a serious wound and with no straightforward way to resolve that wound, that's a problem. It's not just a problem for them. I mean, I can make two arguments, right? One is, dude, it's your problem. This is your psychology. Go see a shrink. Work your shit out. I don't care. But I can also make a statement that it's a systemic problem. It's a problem that we need to address somehow as a system. And I don't know what or how. I've got no play in my pocket.
I think that's where I disagree with you.
Okay.
Because, I mean, I have family somewhere in northern Louisiana.
Yeah.
And I don't know that part of my family. And I visited them when one of my grandmothers died, and one of them was coming back from the market complaining that goats cost $35. So he's like, what am I going to do today when a goat costs $35? And then we talked about barbecue, and one of my cousins talked about how you get the buckshot out of a squirrel. And I'm not going to live with that guy. And he is not cosmopolitan. And he's not going to hang out with me in LA. But we live at a safe distance from each other so that our cultural differences are okay. I don't have to live to his standards. He doesn't have to live to my standards. And people need to sort themselves out into neighborhoods where they can actually be neighbors. And that's the difficulty that we have. It is a big country. And we say it's a free country. Go do what you want to do. Just don't do it in front of my kids in my front yard. And so we have to sort ourselves out. We've had a couple great migrations, and Mormons had to go to Utah to get their way. And some people from Mississippi had to go up to Chicago to get their way. And some people west of the Mississippi came to LA. A lot of my neighbors growing up were from Texas, but none from Alabama. That was on the other side of the river. And so that kind of stuff gets sorted out. And, you know, you can look at one neighborhood in Brooklyn, and one year it's Polish, and another year it's Puerto Rican, and another year it's Dominican. And America moves like that. But you have to be willing to move. You can't just say, this is the legacy of slavery, and I am still here in Alabama, and right over there was where my great-great-grandmother was cheated out of her 40 acres. And if you still live in that place, I mean, those are the kind of stories that I heard. My mother-in-law picked cotton when she was a child, and till her hands bled. Okay, and when her cousin went to take the cotton that they picked to the scales, they lifted the scales. All right. So not only did they have to pick cotton, they didn't even get paid for the cotton that they picked. And one day he looked in that man's face and he said, "You're a liar." And he says, "You can't call me that." He says, "I did." And he said, "I'm never going to come back again." And when I talked to him, he said, "You know, everywhere else in the country, I feel safe. But when the cops are following me in this little town in northern Louisiana, I'm scared to death." So you had to get out of that little small town. You have to be willing to vote with your feet, because the system is just there. It's not everywhere the same. And so you have to find your own place. You have to migrate. You have to vote with your feet. You have to get to where you can live comfortably in America. And some of our greatest minds couldn't find a place. James Baldwin had to leave. You know, Charles Weldon Johnson had to say, this is the biography of an ex-colored man. And he had to go to Europe to find out how American he was. And Kwame Ture had to start off as Stokely Carmichael and then go to Ghana and find another identity. Malcolm X, same thing. So you have to find that place where you can be all that you can be and live comfortably with yourself, and then get rid of all that stuff. You have to purge. You have to cleanse.
So I get it, but let me give another cultural example, and let me
add one provocation. Sometimes an affirmative action scholarship is not enough to do that.
Well, and sometimes it's harmful. I mean, one of the points that I made in talking to Eric, you know, there's the famous resume study, right, where they send out 2 resumes, and one is from Mike and one is from Jamal. Mm-hmm. And Mike gets the interview and Jamal doesn't. Mm-hmm. And I talked to a friend who's an HR executive about it, and I said, "What the fuck? Mm-hmm. Like, is this screening? How does it work?" And he goes, "You know, I'll be blunt." He says, "We can't fire Jamal, right? Because he's protected. He has to be absolutely a great fit before we're gonna hire him. We're not gonna pick him out of the pool, because once he's here, He's mine. I own him. I'm not gonna be able to do anything with it.
Right, right. But John Smith,
dude, sorry, you didn't work out. Move on.
Yeah.
But here's the other cultural question, right? So I'm partly Jewish, and grew up in a community that was almost entirely Jewish. So I'm kind of sort of Jewish, and Jews don't do well when you say, "Hey, get over that whole Shoah thing." Right? My family's not German. We didn't kill 6 million of you. What's your fucking problem?
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of a legit position, right? That you shouldn't get over something like that.
Right.
The issue is that somehow what Jews managed to do, and they had a lot more social capital, and they didn't face all the barriers, although they faced some of the barriers, was they got a country out of it. Right? And I genuinely believe that if Israel didn't exist, and if Israel wasn't such a kick-ass state, that Jewish identity would be much more complicated and negative than it is because of the history.
How many American Jews went to go live in Israel other than the kibbutz thing?
Shit tons.
2 million?
Less. 1 million. But 1 million is still a shit ton.
Yeah, that's a lot.
But that's 1 million over 50 years, so maybe it's not such a shit ton.
I when I used to get into this, it brings back memories of, my ethnicity versus your ethnicity. Why can't you be like the Asians? I'm like, what Asians? The Hmong?
Right.
There's not a lot of Vietnamese that get a lot of respect. Maybe here in LA. But Black Americans, the African American diaspora is very large. To raise that race takes a lot more energy than it does to raise, maybe a minority 1/3 of its size. So we have a lot of leading edge, and we have a lot of trailing edge. And I think everybody does have to find their own strength, but we just don't do it uniformly.
Well, that's kind of the argument that I made a little bit, and this would actually be an interesting thing to go look at the data on. And what I talk about is the fact that that to a certain extent, affirmative action worked. That from 1963 or 4, when it was initially sort of started, to today.
72 with Nixon.
72 with Nixon. I thought something started under Johnson.
Johnson had the idea. Nixon wrote the executive order.
Okay, so 72 under Nixon. A generation of people got jobs as postal workers and city workers and cops and nice, solid, the middle class wedge jobs that the Irish and the Italians had gotten, 50 years before.
Yep.
And that their kids in turn became lawyers and doctors and computer engineers and the people who kind of become the middle class.
Right.
And that what we've had is the cultural equivalent of I spent a lot of time in South Central as a kid, which is a long story and I'm not going to go into. But one of the people who I spent time with down there, my sort of uncle, talked about how when they dropped the restrictive deed covenants in LA, so that black people could actually own property outside of certain designated areas.
Like this neighborhood
right here. All of the middle class black people vanished.
Yeah.
Right? They moved to the Valley. They moved to the South Bay. They moved to West LA. They moved to Orange County. Yep. They left. And they'd been forced to live in this community. So you had a community that was, a stack of opportunities. Mm-hmm. There were dentists and there were lawyers and there were real estate entrepreneurs and realtors and all these other people. And as a kid growing up, you saw all these different people, except that they all left.
Yes.
And the people who got left behind were the people who couldn't get a hand on the ladder and who basically struggled to get one rung up at all, much less, use it to climb further.
I can attest to that. I mean, in my neighborhood, when we grew up, it was part of the West Adams neighborhood, which is one of the nicer parts of Black LA. But there were all sorts in my neighborhood. My next door neighbors, the guy, he drove a moving van. He was a CB from Texas, and they had 8 kids. On my other side was Reverend Robinson, who drove a brand new Lincoln Continental and never came out of the house without wearing a suit. I had never seen the man without a suit and hat on. And then across the street was oh my goodness, I can't remember his Osell Stanley, who was a Dallas Cowboys fan who never let me forget that the Rams lost the conference championship. And I don't know what kind of work he did, but he was a shambling old guy. Remind me of Grady from Sanford and Son, but a little skinnier. But you knew in my neighborhood that there were some poor folks, like the Chambers, who lived around the corners, and there were some people who went to Cotillion. And there was actually an older couple that got a pool dug into their backyard. So it was definitely, this is where the black people lived. And there were multiple classes within that. And we all went to different churches. But by the time my cohort went off, you know, I'm with one of the older brothers, and I come back in the mid-'80s.
It's 5 o'clock.
And the whole tenor of the place had changed. All right, that the crack wars had started, and little knucklehead kids who were 10 were now 15, 16, getting into horrendous trouble. And it was just like the neighborhood went down. It went bad. And all the older folks, they shut themselves in. Everybody else, a lot of people moved out to Pasadena or moved up into Baldwin Hills, View Park. But yeah, the talent went out. And it's not the first time, because in the generation before, my parents' generation, when there used to be the black doctor and everybody went to the black doctor, my parents became civil servants. We all went to Kaiser. And that kind of thing keeps going. And there's a difficulty within the black middle class to bring up everybody that they want to. All right? It's not like the story is not told. It's just some people they said, you know what, I'm just going to be like I am. And that's a very hard thing to deal with. It's a very hard thing to deal with, personally. And I think the black middle class does resent that we had to try to do that extra work, and it didn't work.
So what do you do, right? So I think the issue is, what I had always seen as one problem is really two. And the one problem I've always seen and cared about is the question of, how do you get the people who've been left behind out of their, you know, how do you create a ladder of opportunity for those people who've been left behind? And, you know, and I've spent a lot of time about it, and I've talked to tons of people, and maybe have done one or two things. I don't know, who knows. But what I haven't thought about, and I've kind of dismissed until today, is the fact that there are people like Eric out there who are kind of carrying a weight of anger that I don't understand and that I wish they weren't carrying. And that, you know, and that we as a culture are worse off for them carrying that burden of anger.
Yeah. This is something that Cornel West wrote about. And he said, a lot of black Americans do not look at Western society as simply, you go out and get yours. They're not, it's not that they're not ready. It's just they're not willing. And there's some dual consciousness going on, where they're not being affirmed in the ways that they believe that other people are being affirmed. And part of that is a myth, and it's part of it. I mean, when you grow up around enough white folks, you recognize who white folks think are douchebags. And a lot of black folks don't get that insider baseball. They think everybody, you know, anybody can dye their hair blonde, put on the blue contacts, and walk through Beverly Hills, you know, whether they're from West Virginia or South Beach in Miami. And that's kind of the thing that doesn't get investigated.
So how do you, so here's a thought, right? changing culture and changing psychology is hard. It's harder than
is.
just giving someone, I can write someone a check. I can write a government program that says everybody who lives in these zip codes across America gets $10,000. Right? It'd be hard to pass and it wouldn't do anything, but it's more imaginable to me than getting inside someone's head and talking about what it is they're carrying that makes things hard for them. So the question I want to leave with is, I've always thought that the crushing problem was the people left behind, and that the problem of race in America was foundationally a problem of the very poor. Mm-hmm. And I kind of figured, you kind of got it dialed in, except that you've got, 2 daughters, and you've got to lay up nights worrying about them, and like every other father of daughters does.
I just hope she doesn't marry a Jew.
Oh! Ow! 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 Listen, that's sensitive. That's sensitive. The first time my heart was ever broken was by a black girl in college. Whose dad, by the way, was a judge. Go figure, right? And really, damn, I hadn't thought about that in a while.
Hey, it never goes away. It never goes away.
No, it doesn't.
It doesn't.
But in seriousness for a minute, I think now I'm suddenly thinking that the issue is how to deal with the psychic injury.
Oh, yes. Absolutely. There's healing and curing.
Right.
Reparations would cure. It says, okay, here's your 40 acres and a mule. But, from The Color Purple, Mr. had 40 acres and a mule, but he was damaged.
And the reality is, I don't think the 40 acres and a mule would solve the problem. I think we'd have 2 years of potlatch, and then basically we'd be back where we are today.
Well, the reparations is the cure.
Yeah.
So you could say, this is the tax refund that you get from the legacy of slavery.
And in return, you never get to talk about it again.
Right.
But
people are not healed.
No, they're not healed.
People are not healed.
So this has been interesting. I mean, it's kind of a funny random coincidence that you dropped by today, after I'm chewing on this thing that somebody else wrote on this topic. Mm-hmm. And I think it's something I want to think about a bunch more because, again, I'm of 2 very diametrically opposite minds. There's a part of me that says, get the fuck over it.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, I've got direct family that were, machine gunned in the forests of Germany.
Right.
I've got direct family that were hunted down by soldiers in the American Southwest. I've got blah, blah. We can trade horror stories. Right. But there's another part of me that goes, well, no, not so much. Right. And part of that is that, like it or not, I think this question of, how we deal with people who are black, primarily more black than anything else, is central to one of the questions of what America is. Because I think if you solve that problem, a lot of other problems get unlocked and start falling into place. And I think also that the realization that there's kind of a legitimacy to the hurt that people are carrying around, mm-hmm. that my kind of backhanded dismissiveness mm-hmm. is kind of a dumb shit thing to say, mm-hmm. which is something I didn't think at 7 o'clock this morning. Mm. Is one that I really want to kind of dig around with and play with. I'm not sure kind of where it goes or how it comes from there.
Okay. Well, here's kind of what I would say to close. And this is kind of it is a larger thing, which is when all is said and done, if you love your neighbor like yourself, then for right or wrong, you're going to say, be like me. I don't have your problem, and I can't tell you exactly what your problem is, but this is what works for me. And if you can't bridge that gap, then you have a permanent schism between your expectations of yourself in society and your expectations of black people in society. Mm. Which means I would never let my kids listen to Tupac and Biggie. But for black people, it's okay because they've been damaged. And
that's racist to me. That's like mind-meltingly racist.
Exactly. So you really can't have 2 standards.
No, I don't think we should have 2 standards.
You really can't.
And because we're all kind of stuck living together, and we're in a boat that's leaking and listing a little bit, and we all need to bust our asses to get it righted. Interesting day.
All right.
Except you're an asshole for wearing the same clothes that I am.
At least mine doesn't have writing on it.
Yeah, but you know, mine is cool writing on it.
We'll talk about motorcycles another time.
I'm out.
All right, take care, Mark.
Bye.
Good talking to you. Ciao.
Put that sucker up. Let me go get some jeans on. Hang on.